mandatory mask policy sweep across the cities of Calgary and Edmonton. The corona menace is on the run with only 67 new cases, the lowest number since early July.
Hooray for masks!
It's been 5 days of mandatory masks across the province, but corona cases have jumped to a high of 131, calling into question whether masks are useful or completely useless.
The mask's a lie. We're doomed. Or we can look at the data.
August 1st, the cities of Calgary and Edmonton both implemented mandatory mask policies in all public spaces. Now, around the world, such policies have been implemented and have been quite divisive, leading to some very much in favor and some very much against such ideas. But it's important to take a step back and, well, look at the data to determine whether or not such policies are effective or not. Due to ethical concerns, we can't actually test the effectiveness of masks in a controlled setting because, well, trying to actually infect people with COVID is bad, and we can't do that to determine it. So instead, we can look at data for where masks are used and where they're not used. Luckily, the cities of Edmonton and Calgary decided to implement mandatory masks on August 1st. Now, this is important because it allows us to compare the month of July to the month of August, both of which are summer months. They have similar temperatures, children are out of school, so we can assume that the amount of time spent indoors, spent outdoors, the amount of time around other people will be about the same in each of these months compared to, say, winter months where people would be, say, indoors more and outdoors less. So as a result, we can look at the performance, or that is the number of cases per day of COVID reported in both cities in July, and we can look at the number of cases reported in August and try to do a comparison to see if any change is detectable. We can plot the data for both Edmonton and Calgary, as well as the entire province of Alberta, and try to see what's happening. We have a vertical line here, which is going to delineate July from August. And just from looking at the data, well, the first thing we might notice is that for Alberta, there's not a huge change across the months. It starts off a little low, but then remains mostly constant for the entirety of our time span that we're considering. But in the cities, it's a little bit different. It appears that for Calgary, we have a wave that's going up in July and down in August, whereas in Edmonton, we start lower in July and actually see an increase once we get to the month of August. So throughout this dataset, we have 30 days to look at in July because there were no reports on Canada Day, and we have 31 days to look at in August. Now, the first thing we're going to try is a naive approach using the t-test. Now, the t-test is a classical method for two-sample testing and statistics. It doesn't strictly apply here, though, because our data is not independent. We actually have a time series of data, so there could be temporal correlations which will affect the results. But we can push ahead anyway and at least look at the differences in the average number of daily cases in July to the average number of daily cases in August. Now, across the entire province, we see an increase of about 10 cases per day on average when we move from July into August, which is actually going in the wrong direction. But the mandatory mask policy does not apply province-wide, but just to the two major cities. So let's look at Calgary. Well, in Calgary, we actually had a decrease in about 5 cases per day on average again. But in Edmonton, things went the other way. We had an increase of 27.5 cases per day once we moved from July into August. So of these 3 changes, the only one that can be deemed statistically significant using the t-test would be the massive increase that we saw in Edmonton, which is not boding well for the mandatory mask policy. But again, the t-test is not the exact right thing to use here, so let's consider some other methods as well. A more sophisticated technique for dealing with time series data is change point detection. So a time series is going to be a process that we're watching over time. And there's going to be some noise in the system, but we can make an assumption that the average is about constant over time, and there's little fluctuations up and down. But something could affect the system, a new policy, for example, being put into place, leading to a change in that average value, either an increase or a decrease. So this is often very common with things like foreign exchange rates. If we looked at the exchange rate between the US and Canadian dollar, we know for many years it was about 1-to-1. Then suddenly it quickly started to decrease, and now the Canadian dollar is only worth about 75 cents, and it has been like that for a while. So change point detection can try to pinpoint where these changes will actually occur in our data. So when we apply change point detection to the entire province of Alberta, we actually don't see much of a change at all. We don't detect one. For much of the data set, we have an average of 98 cases per day for most of July and August. At the very beginning of July, we have fewer cases. At the end of August, we have more cases. But for most of the data set, it does remain constant with no detectable changes. Meanwhile, in the city of Edmonton, we do detect a very significant change point around August 3rd, where the number of cases actually increases from about 20 per day to 50 per day. So that is right after the mask policy comes into place, but we're going the wrong way. So we'll have to look at that a little bit closer. So in the case of Calgary, we don't just see one change point, but multiple change points, because going from the beginning of July to the end, we see an increase and then another decrease, followed by a dip in August and then another increase at the end of August. So there's even some more complex behavior here that we have to consider. So a third way to look at this data is through smoothing. So smoothing allows us to extract the trend from our time series, because the time series is very noisy, and we want to separate that noise from the overall trend, the increase, the decrease, the fluctuations in our data set. So to do that, we're going to consider something called locally weighted scatter plot smoothing, which is a way of, in some sense, averaging local time points together to get a smoother representation, and using a bunch of polynomials along the way. So after smoothing, we can look at the total number of cases in Alberta, and we see a little bit of a wave-like fluctuation where it goes up in July, it dips a little bit in August, and then it goes up again at the end of August. And if we look at the city of Calgary, we see a similar trend, maybe a little bit more exaggerated. Now, of course, the entire provincial data set is made up of Calgary plus Edmonton plus all of the other smaller cities, towns, and rural areas. So to see a similar pattern in them is not unexpected. But when we look at the city of Edmonton, we see that it is relatively constant for the month of July, and then begins to increase in August until it reaches a new plateau somewhere in mid-August. So in conclusion, what can we learn from this data? Well, when we look at the trajectory for both of our major cities of Edmonton and Calgary, before and after the mandatory mask policy, well, we see two things. We see different behavior in each city. What we see in Calgary is an increase in July followed by a decrease in August, but it is worth noting that the decrease has actually started before the August 1st mandatory mask implementation of the policy. In Edmonton, we're fairly constant, and then we actually start to see an increase in August, which is not boding well for the effectiveness of mandatory mask policies. So what that means is that we need to take a look as to why this might be actually happening. Let's consider 4 different scenarios or reasons. So number 1, maybe masks don't actually help very much compared to other measures, such as social distancing or washing hands. 2, maybe masks do help a lot, but perhaps people were already wearing them in July before the policies that forced people to wear them came into place. If we already had, say, 70% mask coverage, maybe bumping that up to 100% doesn't really change much. 3, these policies only apply to public spaces indoors. So if most of the transmissions are actually happening in private residences or outside, then these policies would have no actual effect on transmission rates. Number 4, inertia or a lag effect. Because when you implement a new policy like this, it takes time for it to actually take effect. That is, if the incubation time for COVID is long, say a week or 2, then implementing a mandatory mask policy may not yield any results right away, but may take a few weeks before we actually detect any difference. Number 5, we have to consider other factors or covariates which may affect the number of daily reported cases. So most notably, if the number of tests performed per day has increased, then it's very likely that, we'd have more cases reported. So if we started testing more in August, for example, then we might have more cases in August reported, even if mask policies are helping to dampen the spread. Now, I don't have the data on that at the moment, so that'll be something saved for a future video. What's in store for the future? Well, now in September, children are returning to school, and that means we have a new effect entering into our data set. So in a month from now, we could look at the data again to determine whether or not there has been any significant increase or decrease in September now that children are back in school. And this will be a great opportunity to take another look at the data.